What if the greatest empire you ever built was founded on a secret you could never reveal? Not a crime, not a single unforgivable deed, but a quiet deal you made with yourself on a night when the blue glow of a laptop painted your face a color that wasn't quite human. You promised yourself you would not blink when the world stared back at you. You promised yourself you would keep building, even if the scaffolding cut the sky. He remembers the sound of radiator pipes and snow-muffled sirens, the way Harvard winters pressed cold fingers against the dorm windows while code warmed his hands. There was a rhythm to those nights, a drumline of keystrokes and caffeine, a pulse that seemed to sync with the city itself. Mark wasn't chasing money then. He was chasing a puzzle, the strange geometry of people. There were nodes and edges and whispers, and if he drew the lines just right, a map appeared. Not a map of streets or countries, a map of hunger, a map of who wanted to see whom, who wanted to be seen, who wanted to be more than a name. Make something people want, someone had said, and he did. At first, it was a small thing, a digital hallway where you could brush shoulders without the risk of eye contact. Then it was dorms, then houses, then campuses, then the world spit out its keys and said, "You drive." By then he had learned the feeling of refusal, the heat that flares when a door opens and you walk past it anyway. There were would-be partners who smiled too eagerly, and rivals who could not imagine a future without themselves in it. He learned that the future doesn't always accept the version you wish for it. It settles for the version you insist upon. He wore hoodies when people thought he should wear suits. He talked like an engineer when people demanded a statesman. Investors wanted the language of margins and markets, but the product spoke the Esperanto of attention, and attention had its own weather system. He created the news feed and saw the world exhale in relief. At last, a river of everything. Not just status updates, but proof of life. Photos and birthdays, proposals and funerals. A timeline that ran like a vein through the collective body. He watched the graphs climb and felt a mixture of astonishment and dread. Because under the x-axis of growth lay the question he tried not to articulate. How much of the world's loneliness was he redirecting into the river? And how much was he creating? Move fast and break things, they printed on the walls. Speed was not a preference. It was a theology. To move slowly meant leaving oxygen for someone else's fire. So the company learned how to sprint forever. Engineers shipped, product managers tuned. Designers softened edges that cut too sharply. The entire organization learned to delicately pull levers of behavior, as if playing an invisible instrument inside every user's skull. Not maliciously, not at first, but with a confidence that felt like kindness when you were winning. He told himself that if you build a city, you must pave the streets. If you pave the streets, you must set the lights. If you set the lights, people will drive faster and occasionally crash. Keep building. Fix the guardrails later. With the IPO came glare, the white heat of valuation turning into something colder, scrutiny. The man who was once a symbol of charming rebellion became a mirror people pressed their faces to, hunting for flaws. He could feel opinions bend around him like light around a heavy object. He learned the timing of apologies and the vocabulary of regret. He learned to sit in rooms where the air thinned and cameras hummed like insects. He learned to let silence do part of the talking. But the story of an empire is the story of bargains. Some are signed with ink and handshakes. Others signed only in a room you never leave, with witnesses you cannot impress, your younger self, your future one, and the ghost of who you might have been. Here was a product humming with daily life, connecting parents to children, soldiers to spouses, strangers to strangers who felt less strange by the hour. Here also was the second river beneath the first, a current of data where marketers set nets and politicians learned to fish. He didn't invent the hunger for influence, only gave it a stadium with lights that never turned off. There were warnings. Little ones at first. A statistic that made no intuitive sense. A headline that felt unfair, but was not entirely wrong. A team spinning up an integrity project that, if successful, would be invisible, and if it failed, would be the only thing anyone saw. He walked the hallways and listened and nodded, and sometimes pushed and sometimes pulled back, benchmarking everything against growth. Growth was the drumbeat you could not ignore. Growth was proof you were still alive. He remembers a conversation late in the office, when the lights over Menlo Park turned the glass into a dark sea. A product manager, exhausted and earnest, said that the ranking formula favored outrage. Because it favors reaction, someone else added, and reaction correlates with outrage, the way storms correlate with pressure. There were charts, bins of metrics, acronyms that sounded benign. He stared at the curve, and the curve stared back. People choose what they want, he said, a belief and a shield. If we remove choice, we're the villains. If we give choice, we're blamed for it. The room nodded because the room needed a North Star, and he had brought one. He would think about that night years later, and only remember the soft mechanical purr of the air conditioning, and the way the glass vibrated faintly, as if the building itself were shivering. Cambridge Analytica arrived like a word you hear once, and then hear everywhere, a stone thrown into the river that revealed how deep it had gotten. He watched 1,000,000 tweets collide with 1,000 articles and 100 questions in a single hearing room. He sat beneath badges and flags and microphones, the size of thumbs, and learned what it felt like to have your expression slowed down to 120 frames per second by strangers who would study it like a crime scene. He said the lines he had rehearsed because there are only so many words you can push through a throat gone dry. He looked up at the cameras and understood something he had tried not to see. When you build a lens that can see everyone, the lens eventually turns around. In quieter hours, he thought about the origin stories we tell ourselves. The tale of the brilliant dropout who built a new Agora, the friend who accidentally reinvented the address book, the engineer who gave the world a mirror and was surprised to see it look back with teeth. He thought about the early crew, the ones who stayed, the ones who left, the ones who decided they could not be complicit in a machine whose mission statement was still true, but whose implementation smelled faintly of river rot. He told himself he was listening. He told himself listening was leadership. He told himself leadership sometimes meant not listening, because otherwise nothing would get built. He wondered which voice was his and which belonged to the room he had created. Even success can be a kind of isolation. At the top, you learn the art of the acceptable answer. You learn how to build a sentence that satisfies 80% of the world and quietly breaks 20% of you. He found ways to be present. A public run, a charity initiative, a program that trained small businesses to survive on the platform that sometimes swallowed them. He was not a villain in his own mind. Not then, not ever. He was a builder. He was building. Builders do not always choose the material. Sometimes the earth chooses it for you. He had been given attention, and attention is the most unstable of clays. At home, the blue light was gentler. He learned the choreography of bedtime and small shoes with laces that never seemed to obey. In those moments, the empire shrank and the room expanded, and he could feel the reordering of gravity. The river outside kept running, people posting, shouting, rejoicing, grieving, selling, fighting, finding themselves, and losing themselves, and calling it the same thing. He wanted the world to be kinder to itself. He wanted his tools to be kinder too. But kindness did not A/B test well. Kindness had low session time. Kindness was indistinguishable from boredom in the dashboards that kept the company awake. When the metaverse vision took shape, it came not as an escape, but as an extension. If the river was text and images and occasional video, why not build an ocean? Why not construct a place where presence could be purchased and distance mocked? He believed in it the way a diver believes in water. He pivoted the entire supertanker by moving the wheel 100 microscopic degrees and then holding it there while the world screamed about overcorrection. He saw the mockery, the clips, the avatars, with faces too smooth to be beloved. He told himself that every frontier looks like a ghost town before it looks like a city. He told himself that the mistakes were simply first drafts and the ridicule a kind of unpaid focus group. He told himself that if he could endure the heat, the shape of the future would bend toward his patience. But every frontier has a sheriff, and his was not a man, but a ledger. The cost of building a continent before settlers arrive is a number that climbs like a fever. Investors smiled until they didn't. Confidence felt elastic until it snapped. He could feel the company flinch, like a body bracing for a punch. He knew how to make hard calls, and he made them. Cuts came with statements that tried to be surgical. The halls were quieter. Slack channels became confessionals. People left carrying laptops and boxes, and a version of the mission that no longer had a desk of its own. He drafted letters to the team with a tone more human than any keynote. They were words with fingerprints on them. They were words that recognized the difference between vision and appetite. One evening, far past dinner, he walked alone between buildings that held their breath. The campus lights cast long shadows across bikes that would not be used again by the same riders. In the dark glass, he saw not himself, but a series of nested reflections. The student who wanted to map connection, the CEO who wanted to steward it, the father who wanted to tame it, the optimist who believed that any harm could be debugged if the sprint were clean enough. He thought of the secret he could never reveal because it was not a discrete fact, but a lifelong habit. The habit of believing that scale is a virtue in itself, and that the more you have, the closer you are to meaning. He had won. He had more users than some religions. He had turned verbs into properties. He had made, like, something you could count and weaponize, and sell back to people who didn't know they were buying themselves. He had pulled an entire planet closer and discovered that proximity, without understanding, can turn into friction. He had built the most crowded room in history and learned that crowded rooms are the loneliest when everyone is performing. There is a particular silence known only to founders. The hour when the notifications are muted, the calendar emptied, and the machine keeps moving without your touch. It is a holy terror. It is a hum that proves you have successfully replaced yourself with the thing you made. He listened to that hum and tried to feel gratitude, and he did, and beneath it a small erosion he could not stop. He thought of apologies given and apologies withheld, of subcommittees spun up to soften the edges of consequences that were not bugs, but features of human nature scaled to a natural size. He closed his eyes and saw a horizon line that would not hold still. He didn't need to be loved. He needed to be right. Or if not right, then necessary. Necessary is a colder word than right, but it endures. He had come to believe that necessity justifies discomfort, and perhaps it sometimes does. But necessity is a scaffold too, and scaffolds rust when weathered by years of storms. He wondered if the empire would outlast the weathering of its purpose. He wondered if connection, adequately monetized, could still be sacred. He wondered if an ocean can forgive the rivers that feed it. There was work in the morning. There were meetings and memos and roadmaps that looked like constellations if you tilted them. There were tests to run and dials to turn, and speeches to write in a voice that sounded more like a chorus than a single throat. There were new threats and old enemies, and a long list of things only he could decide, and a longer list of things he had to let go. He slipped his phone face down on the desk and felt the absence like a limb he had chosen to rest. For a few minutes, he let himself think in sentences that would never be transcribed. For a few minutes, he let the empire run without him and remembered what it was to be a person who once only wanted to build a little hallway where people could pass each other and nod. He opened his eyes. The blue light waited. He lifted the phone. He let the river back in. He kept the river running, but now he could hear what was in the water. It wasn't just laughter and birthdays and weddings. It was the clatter of rumor, the shape of anger, the hiss of fear. Outrage had a timbre. It traveled faster. He had once told himself that connection was neutral, that a wire does not choose what current runs through it. But neutrality frays when the current burns your hands. There was a morning when a trust in safety lead came with a stack of printouts and a face that didn't bend easily into optimism anymore. She spoke softly because soft meant serious. "There are trade-offs we can't hide from under the word scale," she said. The word scale had always been a talisman, a way to convert complexity into a solvable engineering problem. But here was complexity that insisted on being moral. Here were questions that could not be resolved by another % of precision or a model with 2 more layers. If we improve integrity too much, someone else added, we risk engagement. The sentence tasted like betrayal, even though it described a machine that worked exactly as designed. He changed the slogans on the walls. Move fast with stable infrastructure. The edit sounded grown up, like a careful driver replacing a thrill-seeker at the wheel. He authorized teams that never existed in the dorm room version of the story. Content policy, civic integrity, misinformation, dangerous organizations, child safety. He learned a grammar of harm that could not be measured by daily active users. He heard about coordinated inauthentic behavior and cross-check and meaningful social interactions. He approved more friction. Friction was the enemy of growth, but a friend of sleep. He asked for dashboards that did not glow, only in the direction of revenue. He took a private pride in charts that bent toward safety, even when the streets scolded the charts that bent away from profit. The pride was real. The scolding was realer. He had to remember both at once. There were hearings and there were memos, and there were nights when he mouthed answers, while the shower steamed and the mirror turned to fog. There were questions asked in tones of accusation and questions asked in tones of disappointment, which were somehow worse. There were apologies that made sense, and apologies that felt like placing a hand on a fever and telling it to be reasonable. There were phrases he learned to never say again, and phrases he kept even when advised to bury them. We were too slow. We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility. We will do better. He meant them as a map, not a spell. Maps do not change terrain, but they help you stop walking in circles. He tried to become a different kind of leader without becoming a stranger to himself. He met with critics who arrived ready for theater and left surprised by the human being who did not fit their script. He met with supporters who wanted a flag and left with a homework assignment instead. Prove that what you want from us will not poison the well for everyone else. He met with lawmakers who sought to fix the internet with tools made for railroads and banks. He said yes to some of their proposals, no to others, and maybe to too many. He learned that a yes can become a no by the time it survives a committee, and a no can become an accusation of arrogance. Before lunch, he learned to sit inside contradiction without pretending to like it. The company became older. It complicated in the way organisms do. Defensive layers, signaling molecules, reflex arcs like the ones that pull a hand from a hot stove. The teams that reduced viral lies felt like firefighters in a city where the wind never stops. They built hoses from machine learning and hydrants from policy. They were proud and tired. He was proud of them and tired for them. He wished the world could see their dashboards the way he did, not as weapons, but as shields dented from use. Then there was the electric promise of a new frontier. He would not call it an escape because he understood the accusation in the word. He would call it a continuation, a bet that presence could heal some of what distance had broken. He could see a classroom where a child in a rural town sat in the same room as a scientist across an ocean. He could see a mother visiting a museum with a daughter who could not leave bed that day. He could see boardrooms that were less board and more room. He didn't romanticize it. He enumerated it, the way an engineer rectangles the sky into grids. He rebranded the company to announce the bet. The old name still lived in the apps. The new name lived in the promise. He knew what people said, that the bet was vanity, that the avatars were silly, that the world had other problems, that the old river was still flooding, and he was busy building a lighthouse in a desert. He accepted that ridicule is cheaper than curiosity, that timing is a knife no one holds well. He also knew the numbers. He could feel in the marrow of the company the burn rate of building a city before its citizens arrive. The stock chart became a biography written by strangers, a narrative of hubris and comeuppance sculpted by hands that did not see the meetings he saw. He told himself that if you flinch every time someone sells a share, you aren't building, you're begging. But it is hard to remain erect when the wind changes direction. Even oak trees bend. Layoffs cut through the company like a winter across a field, indifferent to what had grown there in better seasons. He tried to write the letters like a human being who was not pretending that economics is the same as fate. He wrote about efficiency, focus, survival. He wrote about responsibility and the sorrow of losing colleagues whose names he knew and colleagues whose names he would never learn. He wrote about building differently now, about deliberate, slower beats, about doing fewer things better. People appreciated the tone. Tone does not pay mortgages. He understood that too. For all his talk of mission, people live in bodies that need food and homes that need rent. The old slogan about moving fast had never asked them to sprint out of a job. He felt the culture shift under his feet. Ambition remained, but the brash confidence that anything broken could be patched by morning was gone, replaced by a quieter discipline, more testing, fewer promises, smaller leaps. The river changed, too. He tolerated interventions that once would have nauseated him, downranking content that scored high on engagement but low on truth, building systems that rewarded time spent with friends over time spent with strangers yelling. He called it meaningful social interaction, and even if detractors mocked the phrasing, he meant the meaning. He could tell in the data that people's pulse calmed when they saw faces they loved. He went back to first principles. Why build? He could not say to make money and believe himself. Money is a consequence. He could not say to connect the world without flinching at the ways connection had been weaponized. He tried to increase human capacity. Broad, yes. But the broadness allowed a filter. If this feature made people more able, he would nudge it forward. If it made them more brittle, he would slow it. The filter was imperfect. Most are. But it let him sleep an extra hour on nights when the world shouted. There was a day when he visited a small business owner who had built her livelihood on the platform. She showed him her dashboards, the way parents show baby pictures. If you turn off the tap, she said, I'm done. He wanted to promise that the tap would stay on forever, that policy changes would never touch her life. He could not promise that, not if he was honest. Instead, he promised that when the tap changed, she would hear it from them before she felt it from the market. He promised the courtesy of warning. It felt meager compared to the enormity of dependence, but perhaps reliable courtesies are the architecture of trust. He watched his children learn to read in a world where the word feed meant something strange and ecological. He watched them play outside, and he watched them in goggles, and he could not decide which was the truer future. He decided perhaps truth would be hybrid, that the world had long been a mosaic, and he had only given it a name. He became comfortable with the idea that some of his bets would not pay off in his lifetime. He tried to imagine that comfort as humility, not exhaustion. The lawsuits kept coming, because lawsuits are the weather of empire. Some were fair, and some were political theater, and some were both. He cooperated and fought and bargained. He accepted fines that felt like symbols and regulations, that felt like scaffolding the industry should have built for itself. He argued for rules that applied to everyone, including rivals who built similar engines with different paint jobs. He grew weary of the narrative that painted all harm in his colors and all innovation in others. Weariness is not a defense. He knew that. He built anyway. Sometimes he imagined stepping down, the way a climber imagines the valley when the wind is particularly cruel. He pictured a successor who would inherit not only the throne, but the echo of his footsteps. And he wondered whether he had left a clear enough path or simply a set of dents in the floor. He pictured a life of research, of building without scale, of reading without a screen humming nearby. He pictured waking without notification banners already forming their queue. He pictured becoming what he had almost been, a person who finished things before they were judged by the entire planet. He held the picture lightly. He did not frame it. One night, alone in a conference room that had seen better meetings, he opened an old laptop, an antique by the company's standards, the kind that ran slow enough to make patience feel like virtue. He wrote a document and titled it with a date, not a mission. He wrote to the kid who had started this, the one with the radiator and the blue light. He told him that scale had been the secret that felt like a virtue, and that the secret had become a weight. He told him that attention had been the fuel, and also the smoke. He told him that the engineering problem had become a human problem, because humans had always been the system. He told him that he had tried to do better, and sometimes had. He told him that doing better did not mean undoing what had been done, only that new choices could be made with different costs. He didn't print the document. He closed it and let it live unshared, like a confession whispered into a room you trust. He stood and looked out at the campus where lights formed constellations. He thought of all the rooms where his decisions had become other people's mornings. He thought of how much easier it is to start a river than to build a dam. He wondered if he had confused inevitability with destiny, and if the difference mattered. The next day he approved a product change that hurt growth and helped grace. The day after that, he killed a feature he had once argued for, because the world was not the world he'd argued about. The day after that, he doubled a bet on the frontier that still made him feel alive. He had learned that contradiction might be the only honest posture for someone in his position. He had learned to stop performing certainty. He will never be a tidy moral. He is the kind of protagonist whose arc resists simple algebra. He made a mirror and found a marketplace inside it. He built a marketplace and found a courthouse next door. He erected a courthouse and found a carnival in the square. He supervised a carnival and found a church beneath the tent. In each building, he tried to serve the right people at the right time, and sometimes failed and sometimes succeeded, and often did both before dinner. In the end, there is not a fall in the cinematic sense, no sudden plunge from a glass tower into the anonymous street. There is instead a thinning of illusions, of excuses, of the belief that the thing you made is separate from the person you are. There is a man who is less interested in being admired than in being useful, less enamored of scale than of sturdiness, less in love with growth curves than with the small, stubborn work of repair. The empire remains, but its edges are sanded by the admissions he is now willing to make aloud. That connection without care becomes extraction, that amplification is not meaning, that the right to speak is not the right to be believed, and that building a stage does not absolve the architect of what the actors do upon it. He walks the campus in the blue California dusk and hears the electric hum of a world that will not stop for anyone. He will keep building, not because he is sure, but because he is finally comfortable not being sure. There will be more hearings and more articles and more jokes and more moments when someone's grandmother sees a photo she wasn't meant to see, and it will be, for a second, entirely his fault. He will apologize when he means it and defend when he must and ignore when he is wise. He will write memos that try to be less elegant and more honest. He will teach his kids that attention is not love, and fame is not proof, and power is a tool that rusts in the rain. On certain rare mornings, before the river fully wakes, he will open a blank file and think of the hallway he once built for a few thousand people, of the way it felt to ship at 2 a.m. and sleep at 3, of the way friendship once fit into a small rectangle on a dorm room screen. He will not pretend to go back. He will add a line of code, or delete one. He will accept that sometimes deletion is the more merciful act. There are no fireworks in this ending, only the steady hiss of an ocean meeting the shore. Empires do not explode. They erode, and if you are lucky, they evolve. His will, with or without him. The river will keep running. Maybe it will carry more of the right things now. Maybe not. But he will stand a little further from the bank, less tempted to say the current is neutral, more willing to admit it has a direction and that he helped choose it. He will live with the knowledge that he aimed for connection and built a machine that sometimes made people lonelier. And he will keep trying to change the ratio, not because a committee demanded it or a chart insisted, but because he finally sees the scoreboard that can't be televised. And on the nights when the blue light paints his face again, when the world stares back and asks him to not blink, he will remember the secret he can name now without shame. That scale is not salvation. That care is not a constraint, but an ingredient. That the empire he built is only as moral as the smallest choice he makes when no one is looking. He will make a smaller, truer promise to himself, one the radiator boy would understand. Build, yes, but build with the knowledge that your hands leave prints. Build with the knowledge that some of them will be smudges you cannot erase. Build anyway, and then learn to clean. The final chapter is not a fall and not a coronation. It is a man crossing a campus at dusk, uncertain by design, unafraid of the cost of being less sure, and willing finally to trade a little growth for a little grace. It is the quiet acceptance that the greatest empire he built will never be pure, and that purity was never a serious goal. The serious goal is repair. The serious goal is responsibility. The serious goal is to take the scaffolding that once cut the sky and use it to hold up something that will not collapse when the wind changes. He slips his phone face down on the desk again and does not reach for it. The river runs without his touch, and for once he lets it. Outside, the lights steady themselves into constellations he did not design. Inside, he breathes. The world keeps speaking. He listens, and for a long, ordinary minute, nothing breaks.